Our guest today is the Chief Executive Officer for the United Neighborhood Organization, UNO. UNO is Metropolitan Chicago's largest Hispanic community-based organization. Our guest today's mission is to better represent its Hispanic constituents, honoring its immigrant roots and values, and accelerating its assimilation as our nation's newest Americans. He earned his bachelor's degree from Northeastern Illinois University. Ladies and gentlemen, Juan Rangel. Juan?
Thank you very much, Jay. It's an honor to be before this very distinguished group, the City Club, which has hosted many notable speakers throughout its history, and I hope to be able to live up to that standard and tradition. And thank you for having me here today. Also, thank you very much, Father Jack, for your prayers as well. Let me first say that very early on in my public career, I learned the political lesson of dancing with the one who brung you. And even though he was already been introduced, let me recognize my predecessor and UNO founder, now Alderman Danny Solis. He started a great organization almost 25 years ago, laying a foundation at UNO that has allowed me to do what I do since his departure. So, Alderman, I thank you, and I hope that you're proud of the direction that UNO has taken in the last 12 years. And if I may, I'd also like to make note of our emerging Latino leadership, who have their roots grounded in UNO's Metropolitan Leadership Institute, or MLI. First, these have already been mentioned. Jay beat me to the punch here. Our Commissioner of Aviation, Richard Rodriguez, graduating class of 2006 of our MLI Institute, and also the Commissioner of the Department of Human Resources, Mr. Homero Tristan, MLI class of 2003. So welcome. And also Ms. Veronica Alanis, who's Assistant Director of Operations with the Chicago Housing Authority and Chairperson of the UNO Executive Board of Directors. Thank you very much, Veronica, for coming. And also, I'd like to make note, even though it was mentioned also, Mr. Juan R, who began his public career with UNO as a volunteer many, many years ago. And we're very proud of him as the CEO of the Metropolitan Pier and Exposition. Thank you, Juan, for joining us as well. And I would like to make note also of another Hispanic leader who has done much to empower Hispanics in Chicago. That's Mr. Victor Reyes. Thank you, Vic, for joining us today. And finally, I would also like to make note, in his absence, the incredible role that Mayor Daley has played in supporting UNO's programs and charter schools, but more important, in his support of our views on the immigrant experience and how the Hispanic community has followed the path of our immigrant predecessors who built this great city of Chicago. Mayor Daley, whose own family and upbringing are examples of such an experience, knows all too well how to harness the power and potential of an immigrant community, and has done so better than any big city mayor in the country. He understands that it is the old lunch bucket values that has allowed immigrants in this city to prosper and to grow. Well, it is UNO's belief and perspective, and it is the focus of my remarks today, that it is the immigrant experience, immigrant attitudes, and immigrant willingness to overcome adversity that has not only been good for Chicago for the past 171 years, but it is a perspective that needs to continue dominating the political, social, and economic fabric of this city if Chicago is to thrive well into the 21st century. Unfortunately, it is also our belief at UNO that the most significant threat to the progress that Chicago has made is in the politics of victimization, which masquerades as a brand of political and social empowerment for the immigrants of today. Victim or minority politics and its leadership do a disservice to the indomitable immigrant spirit that has brought Chicago this far. We strongly believe that our vital institutions, our churches, our schools, our civic organizations, and our political structures need to learn from our city's past in order for Chicago to continue to succeed. Don't expect a politically correct speech here, but rather a pragmatic view of Chicago's immigrant past and future. Ours is a perspective that some don't like to hear, but it's a perspective and a strategy for empowerment that works. And we have come to these conclusions not out of ideology or political expediency, but rather from our own experiences of listening and working with real people in our neighborhoods, and which have allowed us to succeed in building communities. Chicago has always been challenged by its newcomers, and the city has always met that challenge by seeing the opportunities those immigrants from around the world brought with them. Chicago didn't become the hog butcher to the world or the city of big shoulders by shutting out its newest arrivals. It attracted the masses, including African Americans from the South, by providing jobs. The stockyards, the old steel mills, the digging of the I&M Canal all provided back-breaking opportunities for honest work to build, or after the Great Fire, to rebuild a city. As Upton Sinclair described in his book, The Jungle, it wasn't always a pretty scene, but rather it was a gritty alternative to the harsh realities of the old world. Chicago has always been the city that works, and the new Chicagoans did their part to fit in. Government also played a role in the empowerment of immigrant groups, whether it was the Poles, the Irish, or others from around the world. Politicians doled out patronage jobs that gave access to power to the city's immigrant have-nots, becoming part of Chicago's political life and political lore, while fostering a sense of civic responsibility. Precinct workers made it their proud duty to engage immigrants, not as outsiders, but as potential voters, performing the most sacred of American rights, electing the representatives to government. This, too, was not always a pretty scene. Politics is, after all, a rough business. But it worked. It worked to buy in immigrants into the American mainstream and into the classic American proposition, the opportunity to pursue happiness, and government was there to give you a leg up. It is well documented how Chicago's Irish community built political power and an economic infrastructure through jobs in government. The near legendary Irish immigrant path to power still dominates the political scene in Chicago today. But many others have equally benefited from being cogs of a political operation that worked on behalf of their respective communities. Civic life was accessible for all, including African Americans, long outcasts in the world of power. Some of the great political leaders in Black Chicago were products of machine politics, including Mayor Harold Washington, John Stroger, Cecil Partee, Ralph Metcalf, and William Big Bill Dawson. They too understood the value of politics as a vehicle to empower their communities and managed to succeed. But the promise of happiness in America has no guarantee, only the opportunity to pursue it. For the immigrants of a century ago, social conditions were questionable at best. Housing stock was poor, and working conditions were miserable. Yet civic leaders like Jane Addams sought to build civic institutions that didn't pander to an immigrant's sense of entitlement, but rather challenged them to live up to their potential. English classes were taught at the settlement houses. Nationalist churches and public schools also played a vital social role in the assimilation and the Americanization of immigrants. In spite of the obstacles confronting the immigrant community, these social, civic, and political bodies were the powerful institutions that supported and challenged the immigrant communities, forging ahead to build the city and this country. Now, fast forward to today. It is UNO's belief that if Chicago is to continue to grow and to prosper, then our collective leadership must remain committed to that same immigrant spirit that got us this far. Chicago looks very different than it did over a century ago, yet the draw for immigrants remains the same, the opportunity to work hard and get ahead. Much has been said about the majority-minority status awaiting the Latino community in the United States. It is expected that by the year 2042, Hispanics will be in the majority across the country. Hispanics make up over 28% of Chicago's population today and has increased by 20% between 2000 and 2007 and continues to rise. And just to put things in perspective, in 1900, the Irish foreign-born Chicago totaled about 74,000 people, making up about 4.35% of the population. In 1930, Chicago's first and second generation Polish totaled approximately 401,000 people, and that's almost half of today's Hispanic immigrant community in Chicago, which stands at around 774,000 strong. Let's get it straight. Immigrants, legal or not, seek a shot at economic prosperity. They always have, and today's immigrants are no different. They replenish America's workforce with an unparalleled work ethic. No job is ever considered too low. It's the next step up. The Hispanic unemployment rate is very low. Some even have 2 jobs. Well, if you think about it, even those that are in this country that aren't supposed to be working are working. So they breathe life into our economy with entrepreneurial vigor, building thriving businesses in every community they live in. As consumers, their brand loyalty and growing purchasing power have big business catering to their every want and need. And if you have any doubt, you can certainly come to my community of Little Village to witness it for yourself. Immigrants rejuvenate aging neighborhoods by purchasing homes at a record pace. They repopulate great American cities like Chicago that have lost white and black middle-class families to suburbia. They celebrate traditional values, family and religious values, and are optimistic about their economic future. Like their European predecessors, the optimism shared by the immigrants of today leads them to embrace assimilation. In myriad ways, they live and bolster the classic American dream: get better jobs, buy bigger homes, watch satellite TVs, and even with these soaring gas prices, they drive the newest and biggest SUVs. And even with the median household income of $41,500, they save enough to send billions every year back to Mexico or other Latin American countries. But not all is rosy in immigrant communities across Chicago or the U.S. The challenges that confronted this city through generations of new arrivals continues in Chicago's Hispanic neighborhoods. For example, only 9% of Latinos have bachelor's degrees, only 5% of Latinos have associate degrees, and most sobering of all, only 30% have high school diplomas. There is no starker way to illustrate Chicago's challenge for the future than the shocking dropout rate in some of our neighborhood public schools. Clemente High School only graduates 54% of its students. Wells High School only 53%. Juarez High School 49%. And Farragut Career Academy only 44%. Considering these figures and this high school dropout crisis, along with a high teen pregnancy rate, a pervasive drug culture, and a critical gang infestation in many of our immigrant communities, and considering the largest wave of immigration this nation and this city has experienced, the future of Chicago ought to be in question. Yet one can easily argue that these figures are probably not that dissimilar from those pertaining to immigrants long ago, and they managed to do quite well. That is probably an accurate statement. However, the opportunities to prosper, or at least to sustain a family without a formal education, were much greater back then. Chicago's economy no longer depends on the stockyards, and the steel mills of South Chicago have long shuttered. And even the old patronage system that served the ethnic, immigrant, and working class of Chicago well for over a century, the political structure that, with all its faults, created a pipeline for employment and empowerment for the have-nots of yesteryear, is on its way to being reformed. And quite possibly, and unfortunately, with unintended consequences, denying access to power for many of today's immigrants and minority communities. But there is an upshot to this story, and that is, in spite of the new hurdles and in spite of our changing economy, the indelible immigrant spirit remains alive and well in Chicago. But what has changed and threatens to be a significant test to the immigrant resolve and success is our politics. And this is where we as a city must make a choice for our future. We can choose to continue the successes of the immigrant experience that has served the city so well, albeit imperfect, or choose a minority politics that casts immigrants and minorities as victimized people of color in need of social justice. We can choose to portray our communities as poor, vulnerable, and downtrodden, or as strong, hardworking, ambitious, and optimistic people on their way up, which immigrants have always been. We can choose to defend, if not excuse our deficiencies in our communities, or challenge ourselves and our people to do better. We can choose to protect failed institutions like the public schools and their varied interest groups, or choose to create and develop solid institutions that are the bedrock of our communities. We can choose to create an adversarial relationship with authority figures like the police or firefighters, or choose to embrace them as our protectors from gangs and vandals in our midst. We can choose to enact public policies that promote mediocrity in our communities and limit our potential, or policies that challenge our community to rise to the occasion over adversity. We can choose to produce leadership that panders to an entitlement mentality and coddles its people as paternalistic neighborhood gatekeepers, or leadership that rises to the opportunity to challenge its own. No excuses. Let me be clear, this is not about Latinos and not about the Latino community dominating Chicago's politics, but rather about a perspective that has dominated Chicago's political and social landscape for well over a century, and whether such a perspective has a chance to survive in today's politically correct climate. It's a perspective that rejects victim politics. The immigrants of today lack the same institutional support and challenges that our predecessors had. There are several reasons for this. Weak political organizations whose patronage system has been curbed by reform, a weakened church plagued by self-doubt and scandal, an ethnic media that promotes nativism over Americanization, an education system that caters to bureaucracy and interest groups rather than to community, an outdated civil rights empowerment model that served the African American community well in its day but has limited use for the immigrant communities of today, a leadership that is reluctant or adverse to assimilation efforts, including instituting a sound English language acquisition policy, and a cynical mainstream media that is threatened by mass communication and which scandalizes every nuance of civic involvement, among others. All of these are unknowing contributors poised to challenge what has worked for immigrants in the past. And the question remains, immigrant versus minority leadership, who will lead Chicago's future? The answers are to be found in the institutions that we are building. Do we have, or are we creating those neighborhood institutions and our leaders that serve as powerful anchors that build solid communities, similar to neighborhood clubs and associations that helped immigrants join American society a century ago? Probably not. But the challenge is all of ours. What we at UNO have demonstrated for the past 25 years is that Hispanic immigrant families and their children can succeed, not as angry, segregated people in America, but as part of a common American citizenship. Victim politics has never worked as an empowerment tool for Chicago's past immigrants, and we cannot afford to handicap our community by relying on it today. It is therefore our responsibility to ensure that immigrant success continues across the entire city as it always has, for the benefit of all Chicagoans and for the benefit of Chicago's future. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions.
I have a couple of questions. My name is Anthony Cole. I'm also on the Board of Governors for the City Club of Chicago. And I'm real pleased to have our guest speaker today and hear what he's talking about. I have a couple of comments or questions I want to make, and then I'm going to read one to somebody turning. Any more questions out there, by the way? Tom, can we get those picked up? One of the first questions I have is there's two things that seem to be pressing upon and challenging minority communities here in Chicago and across the state. One is education. Senator James Meeks has been pushing that real heavy, the quality of education here in the city versus other areas. The second one, as you mentioned, is gang violence and drugs. And I also am the chairman for government relations for the Illinois Alcoholism and Drug Dependency Association. We were in Springfield last week. And fortunately, the House of Representatives passed unanimously to restore the funding cut of 40+% statewide, 113 votes yes, 0 no's. So I'm wondering what, in your perspective, can be done to address this problem of gangs and drugs. Obviously, we need more treatment for people who are already addicted, so they don't end up in jail at high cost and ruin their lives and their families' opportunities. And secondly, somewhat related, obviously, is education. If we can keep our people in school long enough to get out of high school, look at opportunities for college, we can advance our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let me say that one of the things that we've been doing the last 10 years is operating charter schools, and we are now we have 9 schools across the city, and I think what makes our schools not necessarily unique, but what stands out is a very structured and disciplined environment for our kids. And I say that because I think that what's happened in our society is that we've become a little bit too permissive in terms of what's acceptable behavior within our community, almost to a point where we become apologetic for that kind of behavior, as if that's the norm, and if anyone dares to criticize it, somehow that's a criticism of our community. And I think we make it very clear that that's where we draw the line. There's a gauntlet that we throw down, and we say that is not representative of our community, that's not representative of our culture. And I think that's the kind of message that leadership has to start promoting more of, and just say there's just things that are not tolerable within our community. When I talk about political correctness, somehow I think that we accept a certain behavior because somehow it's viewed as an affront or an attack on our communities, and that's not the case. I think the majority of youth in our neighborhoods, whether it's black community, Hispanic community, are good kids. But the problem is that there's no one speaking on their behalf. There's a lot of leadership that speaks on behalf of the negative elements within our community, and that's fine, but someone needs to balance that out. And I think that when we talk about the immigrant experience and all, I think that it's really meant to challenge our own community, and say that there's just certain things that we find unacceptable within our own neighborhoods. And when it comes to schools and education, I think there's a lot of things that could happen within the schools. And I think Chicago Public Schools and the mayor has done a tremendous job, have gone a long way. But these are controversial things that need to happen. The mayor and Arnie Duncan has shut down schools for non-performance. That's very controversial. I would say more of that needs to happen. I would also argue that up to now, not one school that has been shut down for non-performance is in the Hispanic community. I would say that there's plenty of schools in our neighborhoods that need to be shut down for non-performance. But what that means is that not everybody keeps their job. A lot of people are going to lose their job in that endeavor. That's not an easy thing to do, and that's a challenge to all of us in leadership to be willing to make those sacrifices, make those tough calls, and so be it. When it comes to school funding, I always say this, and I'd probably be on TV, so I shouldn't say it in public maybe. If Arnie Duncan asked me to go down to Springfield for more money for the schools, I'd probably be the first one on that bus, because we can always take more money. And I'd probably use that money to pay our teachers even a higher salary. But with a higher salary comes higher standards, and then we have higher expectations for them. So not everybody gets to keep those high salaries. But frankly, I think our schools are outperforming the neighborhood schools with just as much money as the regular public schools. In fact, I think we get less money because we have to pay down a debt, we have to pay leases from the archdiocese. So we're actually spending less money in educating children individually than the public schools, yet we're still outperforming them. So I'm not sure if money is quite the answer either.
Thank you so much. I may editorialize this. Not only money, but it's accountability. Absolutely. Yeah, we need more accountability in the system. Another question is, do you think that the current poll on Latinos in the presidential election will change as the election gets closer?
I guess it depends who's asking. I think that's an interesting question, because I think it goes back to the primary election, where a lot was said about Barack Obama's inability to garner significant Latino vote across the country, including here in Chicago. I believe the 4th Congressional District went for Hillary Clinton, and I know because Alderman Danny Solis's sister was working that campaign, the 25th Ward went for Hillary Clinton as well. I think that question really comes down to the crux of what I was talking about earlier today, of what the immigrant experience is versus a minority experience. I think that there's always been an attempt to try to bring or bridge a divide between the black community and the Hispanic community, as if that's supposed to be an absolute or a must. And I think it's that way because we're both labeled minorities, we're both people of color and all that. But those are very superficial labels that really have nothing to do with our experiences. Either it's the black community experience, the black experience in America, or the immigrant experience in America. Very different experiences, yet somehow because we're people of color, we're just lumped together as minorities and we're supposed to all just get along and accept each other. Well, that's just unrealistic. That just doesn't happen in any community and all. It shouldn't necessarily necessarily happen for this community. If you think back to the election of Harold Washington back in 1983, Hispanics did not vote for Harold in overwhelming numbers in the primary election. That vote was split between Jane Byrne and then State's Attorney Rich Daley. But it wasn't until the general election, when Harold Washington was facing Bernie Epton as a Republican, that Hispanics supported the Democratic nominee, which was Harold Washington. So I don't think that Hispanics will not vote for Barack when the November elections comes around. But I would make note that 4 years ago and 8 years ago, George Bush did garner about 40% of the Latino vote across the country. So I don't think that necessarily is going to change either. Thank you.
Excellent response. We have another question. Recognizing an increase among documented Mexican immigrants at the polls, there appears a huge number that do not participate in the process of voting. What can be done to get people out to vote?
Well, I think that goes to the heart of the matter in terms of the old organizations that used to exist. I think we're the victims of very poor political organizing, if I could say that, and with all due apologies to those of you that do that kind of work. I don't think Alderman Ed Burke has a problem getting the vote out. I don't think that Mike Madigan has a problem getting the vote out. Alderman Mell, and those are heavy Latino wards. And so I think that we have to do a better job of organizing ourselves and creating those political organizations, which are harder and harder to do these days because the way political organizations used to work is you get your precinct captains, you get them a city job, and they're out there hustling to get the vote out. That's not quite the same way anymore. So how else are we going to get people? Not just wishful thinking and not just putting out nice ads, but you got to inspire and you got to get people to come out to vote. That's what every other community does, and our community should be no different.
Very good. One last question. Immigration reform. If you could have input with the new president on this issue, what do you say? Does the economy play a role, pro or con?
I'm partly because of what I do for a living. I'm a strong believer in immigrants and how they come to this country and rejuvenate our economy and our communities across the country. But I think for political purposes, in terms of how do you get immigration reform passed, and this will be very controversial, I think, in the sense that it didn't pass when there was a Kennedy-McCain bill last year. They had the support of most of the folks on the far left in support of immigration reform because most of the country saw it for what it was. It was just another amnesty. It was kind of those wink, wink, it's not amnesty kind of thing. But it really was, and I think the rest of the country saw that. And I think if we're really honest about wanting to pass immigration reform, we have to be mindful of what folks in Middle America are concerned about. And I don't think it's just a question of racism and discrimination, people that don't want immigrants in this country, although there's a little bit of that in some quarters. I think it's really more a question of people just feeling insecure about their future. Everything that I talked about today, if we're honest with ourselves, we have a very high dropout rate. We have issues in our community. We have gang violence. We did a poll in 2003 that went from here all the way to DuPage County amongst Latinos. This was a poll amongst Latinos. And the biggest issue that people had concerns about was gang violence. Not just in Chicago, not just in Pilsen Little Village, but all the way to DuPage County amongst Latinos. So I could imagine that others that may not be familiar with this community may have a bit of a question as to what it means to have 12 million people here undocumented and what it means to the future of this country. I think to some degree the way we address that is we really put the question out to the 12 million that want to become legalized, is what's their commitment to building this country, just like every other immigrant group has done in the past. And what I'm talking about there is there a path towards assimilation and is there a path to Americanization? Those are very controversial terms. Those are things that a lot of people don't want to hear about, especially our friends on the left. So if those are the things that are going to get us an immigration reform, I think that we should seriously consider it, or else we're just playing around and we're just pandering, but really not really looking to have a solution at the end of the day. But it's not going to be easy. I think you have a very, very widespread in terms of that divide. But I think at some point we have to offer something to the more of the middle of the roaders and more of those that are on the right, so they can feel comfortable that these folks that are here really are here to contribute in building this country.
Excellent presentation. I wanted to obviously want to acknowledge Jay Doherty for the leadership he's provided to the City Club of Chicago. It's an outstanding venue for the public to talk about public policy and politics. Come on back. We're not through yet. And it's great to see a packed house. That's typical at the City Club. For those who like the presentation today and you look at the roster for future and upcoming presentations, please feel free to join. It's only $50. It's a great place to network, a great place to hear the latest and the greatest what's happening in the public arena, in politics, what have you. So please join us today. How do you pronounce your name again?
Juan.
No, Juan. No. I have something for you. I think it's Rangel.
Rangel.
Yes. Here's a cup from the City Club.
Thank you very much.
Drink to your health. And when you can't sleep at night with all these public policy issues running through your brain, just pick up a copy of the City Club of Chicago, Our History. It will relax you. And a free membership. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The meeting is adjourned.